Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. I'm James Zimmerman and I'm going to be your host for today's show. Today we're talking with our guest Jordan Peacock. Welcome, Jordan.
Good evening.
This is the second of two shows that we're doing with Jordan, so watch part one first. Actually, I think this one might stand alone on its own pretty good, actually, too. But so Jordan has been in the Minnesota Atheists Burnsville Book Club since 2012. He was a panelist at the November meeting in 2013 too. But the reason why he's on the show today is because he's studying the philosophy of technology in his graduate school, and he currently runs Nous Machina, which is a consultancy for software solutions and para-academic research. If you want to read more about him than what you're going to hear in the next half hour, you can read at ribbonfarm.com, where he is a resident blogger, and he says that more of his half-baked ideas are at hewhocutsdown.net. Yep. So in part one, we talked about social technologies. We're going to kind of follow that up here because we want to explore some of the modern arguments against metaphysicians. We want to talk about what that is, what it means, what the implications are, especially for people who consider themselves atheists or at least just non-theistic. We want to also see if we have time to get into, like, is there a difference between realism and materialism? But like we were just saying before the show began, before we can dig into any of that, maybe we should agree on some definitions so that everyone's on the same page, at least for this show, so that no one sits there thinking, yeah, but the whole time. So let's start with metaphysics or metaphysicians. Do you want to explain to us what that term means as you're going to use it here?
Most of metaphysics is usually defined as, arguing things that can't be concretely defined purely from physical evidence. And that's usually how the term is used. And so people talk, Aristotle had physics and metaphysics, and it wasn't quite divided the same way, but people took that division and basically said, right, physics is the physical world and metaphysics is everything else. I'm more partial to the idea of, Foucault used this term episteme, meaning the kinds of things that you had to agree to in order to disagree. So what are the things that you're agreeing about implicitly in order to disagree? Most of metaphysics is really about arguing about those implicit agreements. And so, for example, a working scientist might say, I'm trying to find the causal factors that lead to this particular thing. And the metaphysicians will argue about causality. And what is causality? And is it only like a single cause, or can there be multiple causes? And do they always have to be in the past, or can you have a cause from the future? And that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. So then in contrast to metaphysics, would physics equate to realism and materialism? Maybe you can tease out the differences between those.
So realism and materialism tend to be contested terms. In the way that I'm going to be using them here, and in the way that the people I cite tend to use them, materialism means that there is nothing non-physical in the universe. So in other words, even when you're talking about things like information, that information is instantiated in atoms somewhere. So there isn't anything extra that's being added. Realism is a superset of materialism. So some materialisms are realist, but not all realisms are materialist. And most commonly people would think of some of the Neoplatonic ideas where math is real, but math is more fundamental than the physical universe. So, what is math? How does that work?
Yeah.
So some of those ideas would say, well, math is real, but it's not this physical thing. It's not dependent on being instantiated in physical objects, but we still want it as part of our bigger idea of the universe, the multiverse, all of existence. And so that's one example of a realism that I wouldn't call a materialism, because it has non-material components to it as well.
So you've suggested that there's been a surge in metaphysical speculation lately. What are some of those speculations? Why the surge now?
Yeah, I think and the interesting thing from this as well is this isn't a religious surge. In fact, nearly all of the proponents are non-religious or atheist.
Okay, yeah.
So, these are people who are exploring questions beyond science, often from a very science-positive perspective. Many of them come out of philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of physics, the science studies, and they extend from that and they say, well, what are some of the underlying features that would have to be true, or that would seem to be indicated by what we see in science, but that science can't itself answer for us. And some of those are questions of knowledge, but a lot of them are questions of ontology. Ontology is what exists. And for a long, long time, basically ever since Kant, Immanuel Kant, for a long, long time it was basically said, well, you don't have access to what does or doesn't exist. You only have access to your sensory input, and therefore you have to be very humble, in a sense, about what does or doesn't exist. David Hume, made this a very extreme case where you really can't postulate anything except the fact that you receive this or that sensory information. Most modern philosophers in ontology say, well, that's not necessarily true. You can't know for certain that a particular object exists, but you can know, some of them would argue, that objects exist. And so there's one contingent that argue for a kind of object-oriented ontology, which is this idea that there is many, many, many different unitary things that persist through space and time that all have the same problem that Immanuel Kant talked about. I as a human can't ever really grasp the whole reality of another person or of a tree or of a desk, but what these object-oriented ontologists are saying is the same is true of the tree and the desk to you. There's this constant partial interaction where we don't have adequate knowledge of each other, but that doesn't negate our separate existence.
And then you also indicated that posthumanism was another type of metaphysics. Do you want to explain that?
Oh, posthumanism is more of a worldview, but it's a recognition, and it really comes in line with many of these metaphysical movements, which is that in the past, philosophy was really tied up with the subject-object division, where the subject was the human being, and the object was anything else. Or you had people like Heidegger, who was obsessed with being and the nature of being, and this was a very anthropocentric perspective, very human-centered. And many modern philosophers are pushing back on that and saying, look, this is kind of a new Copernican revolution where we have to move away from our own self-obsession and look at the world and realize that we are a part of it. We are a part of it. We should continue to concern ourselves with humans. We should continue to think about humans. But there are other things out there, and they don't necessarily involve us. And posthumanism kind of takes that and says, not only that, but the identity of human is plastic. We've changed throughout time. We've changed through evolution. We've changed ourselves through technology. And not only can we continue to change, we should actively continue to change. And some of that might be through active intervention. Some of that might be through new technology or new kinds of social organizations or new kinds of medical engagements.
And you mentioned posthumanism was kind of a reaction to, what you call it, hyper objects or hypermaterialism?
I think it's parallel to that.
Okay.
Tim Morton came up with the concept of a hyper object, which was basically, we're comfortable with talking about a tree or a desk as an object because they're kind of the right size and of the right temporal duration
we can
for
grasp
us
it.
to
Yes.
grasp.
Yeah.
When you start talking about something like climate change, is that a thing? Or if you start talking about like something like the Paleolithic, era. And what is that?
Is it that it's getting too abstract for us, or it's just too large in some way?
It's too large, or it's too diffuse, or maybe it's too brief in time, or it's too minuscule, or there's too many interactions. It's one of those things where we can posit its existence, but we really struggle to intuit anything meaningful about it. And so we often need aid. And we'll use analogy, and we'll use computer modeling, or we'll use other kinds of mental supplements to assist ourselves with, these things. Because, in the example of climate change, it's important to understand it, but it's one of the major hang-ups with that is trying to get across to people that your local weather conditions this very moment don't really necessarily say anything about climate change as a phenomenon. There was a recent XKCD comic that captured this perfectly, which was where someone was commenting about how cold that particular day is, and their friend was saying, well, it's been trending warmer for the last 15 years, and the reason you find this cold is because it was so much warmer the last 2 or 3 years. And so then the last section of the comic was this fellow saying, oh, there's a puddle in December in St. Louis. Who says there's global warming?
Yeah.
And the joke being that it was,
such a small
the
thing,
frame has shifted so gradually for so long that that's now seen as quite cold.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship then between theories like that and science proper? Like, how do those theories, do they influence the study of, say, global warming or anything else that's scientific?
At their best, there's a dynamic two-way discourse, because Daniel Dennett talked about there's no science done without an underlying philosophy. There's only science done, or there's sometimes science done without an examined philosophy. In other words, sometimes the scientist isn't aware of the philosophy that they're using behind it, and I missed the second half of the question. Can you repeat that?
I was just saying the relationship between the theories that we just talked about and science proper. Like, do these metaphysical theories have any influence on, say, climate change, or the study, I should say, of climate change, or the study of even physics or biology?
There are a couple really good examples. James Ladyman and Don Ross wrote a book called Everything Must Go, and they posit an ontology that's not completely dissimilar to that Neoplatonic math idea, where they talk about what's really real are real patterns. These are these very, very abstract entities, and then they kind of explain how everything else derives from those. They are very highly trained in cutting-edge physics. In fact, they have repeatedly talked about how it is essential for philosophers to really up their game with their understanding of what modern science has to say. So they're an example of philosophers who are very deeply engaged with what science has to say, and try to make sure that whatever they work with, at the very least, conforms to what we know and can possibly aid with what we don't. On the flip side, you have people like Bruno Latour, who's a French science studies thinker, and he really started his work doing deep analysis of the entire systems of things, and he developed what became known as actor network theory, where the actants in these networks could be human or non-human, and he drawing out the relationships of these. And so he could use these to explain things like the development of the French subway system, or he wrote a book about the gradual acceptance of pasteurization. It was called The Pasteurization of France, where usually the story is only thought of in a very narrow context, and he did a whole bunch of quantitative work showing all the different dynamics, and many of which were not so much material as they were social and psychological. And how did all of these different social and psychological and material and political elements come together to see this rise of pasteurization? So that's an example of a feedback loop back into that, where that's actually been affecting the ways people think of complex systems and the ways people come to approach problems that have social components as well as scientific components.
Okay. Yeah. I know another example that you provided for me was fitness landscapes.
Yeah.
Do you want to just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones.
Okay.
Personally,
Well,
that comes out of so two fields: evolutionary biology and topology in mathematics. And the idea of a fitness landscape is you can kind of think of a contoured map, where you have your mountains, your peaks, and your valleys. And in evolutionary biology, when you have a fitness landscape, these peaks are defining local evolutionary fitness for a particular organism. The interesting thing with that is it lets you describe why you would get certain kinds of genetic drift versus others. Because if you have some sort of population that is halfway up a particular peak, you would argue that over time they're going to continue to move up the peak, because if you have random genetic drift, all the drift that goes up the peak is more fit in that context than the ones that drift down. Now there might be a higher peak, but there might be a valley in between them, and so even though theoretically you can say, well, it would be more fit to do this, there may be no viable route between the two of those. And these landscapes aren't static. And so what happens is, let's say you have this huge environmental shift, and suddenly the peak that they were moving towards suddenly just flattens completely. Then you get this exploration where people, the species kind of branches out and, okay, we're not sure where we're going, and one part of the population finds the beginnings of another peak, and then suddenly you see a huge shoot up that, and that's how you get these differences evolutionary. So that's how they use it to talk about it. It's metaphorical.
Yeah, sure.
But you have people like Manuel DeLanda, who's studied societies, and he's works in ontology as well, where he uses the concept of fitness landscapes and the physical concept of singularities to talk about how we get scaffolding systems and how we get physical emergence. And he defines emergence not in the mystical way, but basically as things that only come into being at certain scales. So for instance, like you might have a few air molecules swirling around, but you wouldn't say you had a miniature hurricane.
Yeah.
A miniature hurricane might have the same air patterns, but at a certain quantity, it becomes qualitatively different. And now you have this new dynamic. And so, he uses fitness landscapes to describe where the attractors are that would cause things to move toward one particular state of affairs versus another, or develop into one particular state of affairs versus another. And he actually has a really good book called Philosophy and Simulation, where he actually walks through modern computational simulations of all of the different scales, from single-celled to multi-celled creatures, from different stages of evolution right up to different stages of societies. And he evaluates the models and talks a bit about them as well.
Your mention of computation reminds me that we can't really talk about realism or material things these days without the term virtual reality coming up, or at least coming up into our heads. So what is meant by virtual reality? How does that play into all this too?
So that actually dovetails very nicely with when DeLanda was talking about these fitness landscapes and these attractors. He's saying that landscape is real, but not material. So in other words, and this is kind of, if you take the metaphor from the evolutionary biologists, you only actually have that population and the environment, and the existence of this landscape where there's a more or less fit place to be is more of a hypothesis.
Yeah.
DeLanda extends that a bit, and he talks about the idea that beings have these kind of topologies that say this is your phase space. These are the different ways that you can be. It's not anything, but it's not limited to what you currently are either. And this was drawing out of the work of a French thinker named Gilles Deleuze, who derived a lot of work from morphogenesis and calculus, and came up with a book called Difference and Repetition that DeLanda's kind of carried on with now that Deleuze is dead. And so the virtual in this case is really the space of possibilities that's available in a given state, only one of which is actualized. So the actual and the virtual together consist of the real in this context. So the actual is the actual material
tangible,
environment that we're working
mm-hmm.
with, the tangible, this is the state of affairs, and this is the arrangement of atoms that everything's in right now. And the virtual is then describing the other spaces of possibility that could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple times you used the term metaphorical. So is there anything practical, like what, besides this just being intellectually stimulating or expanding, what are the practical takeaways that like our viewers could learn from this?
Yeah, I think one of the two big takeaways are, first of all, that there are questions that science doesn't answer, and that's not a flaw. That's just, we understand that boundary.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean those questions aren't worth asking. And some of the ways we pose those questions give us tools to then feed back into our own lives. So for instance, the object-oriented ontology that I talked about, there's a fellow named Levi Bryant who's articulated a number of political ideas that draw from those foundations. And so he's using them to encourage new ways of thinking about political organization that take into effect not just the semiotic, not just the signs and propaganda and things like that, but also things like how entropy works and how people have time restrictions on their lives and things like that. I mentioned Bruno Latour's work, that there's a theory component to it, but there's also a practical research component to it that has also deepened our knowledge of the systems that it gets deployed in. And the theory is a way to enable the research, and the research is a way to enable the theory.
Okay.
More broadly, the concept of metaphor itself. There's a recent book by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sander where they argue that analogy itself is one of the foundational tools of human thought, and our ability to build and develop these categories for ourselves is a tool for bootstrapping our thinking. And so many of the richness of these ideas is coming from ways to take an idea from science, bring it into metaphysics, and then sometimes bring it back in a new and transformed way into our own lives.
I know another takeaway that you said we can get from this is empathy towards one another. Do you want to? We have 5 minutes left, but so that's how long you can talk about it.
I think the biggest thing with empathy is that recognizing where, because this is speculative, you can't sit down and say, I know for a fact that math is foundational to our universe. You can make a good argument for that, but there's ultimately no final, teacher signing off at the end of the day saying, yeah, you got that answer right. And so that is a recipe for humility if you'll take it. Not everybody takes that lesson, but it's a recipe for humility if you'll take it. And so one of the things that I've found coming out of this is I found myself much more willing to hear someone out and take a step back and say, this seems really, really different to me.
Is it because you recognize that they can't completely communicate with you? There's always some miscommunication there?
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing too, is all communications, miscommunication. And there is an understanding that whatever I'm saying to you is being translated by your own internal structures and your own history and your own biases and your own background. And everything that I'm hearing from you is the same. And so when when you get into that situation and recognize that, you can actually start targeting things explicitly, where you say, I'm talking to my child, and I'm going to talk to them in a way where they can translate what I'm talking to into something that's meaningful for them in a particular way.
Yeah.
And you can take a very experimental approach to that with people. And I found that as a very valuable relationship building.
Valuable tool.
Very
to
valuable
use the term
tool.
we used earlier.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay, so with just the last couple minutes we have left, you sprinkled some of the book titles that you would suggest throughout the show, but let's bring them all together here, because I know that they're going to show the titles on screen. But do you want to maybe tell us Everything Must Go you recommended?
So Everything Must Go is where Don Ross and James Ladyman talk about real objects, real patterns. And these are the people that you'll probably want to have at least had a primer in modern physics for reading it. It is probably the most dense book in this, but it's also the most scientifically engaged on that score. So if that's your thing, that's a good book.
Another one you liked was Levi Bryant's The Democracy of Objects.
Yes, that's actually freely available from his publisher online.
Oh, okay. To read online?
As a PDF, or you can buy the book. But that's just an explosion of ideas. I was just rereading it lately, and he comes from all over the place and brings these ideas that you never would think would come together, and he brings them all into one place, and it's an excellent.
Really horizon expanding then?
Very horizon expanding.
And then Surfaces and Essences?
Yeah, that was the book by, it was co-written by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sander.
Yep.
Excuse me, in English and French. And that was really focusing on the role of analogy and the role of metaphor in how our brains work, and how that comes through psychologically, and how that comes through interpersonally.
All right. Well, thank you. That gives people plenty more to go on.
Yeah.
So, and I appreciate you being on both halves of the show here and talking with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching or for listening to our show. This is Atheists Talk, and if you are interested in what you see here, or if you have ideas for another program, please contact us. We will be happy to send you a complimentary copy of our newsletter, The Minnesota Atheists, because if you are interested in us, we're interested in you. Again, thank you.